don't seem to have any sound, but that's okay. I'm going to go straight into it, and it can all be cleaned up in post. 5, 4, 3. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host, along with co-host Peter Bale. I'm in Wellington, but Peter, you're in Auckland in Hoon Bay.
I'm in my normal place in Hoon Bay. Yeah. We're hanging out with the boomers.
Yes, and what you can see here in the background is the Wellington railway station. I'm right at the centre of activity after an enormous week here with the hīkoi, and tomorrow I'm going to be part of the Pakukore Poverty by Design conference. It's being set up and run by the Stout program at the Victoria University, Poverty by Design. So I've also managed to speak to a bunch of the speakers for When the Facts Change, the spin-off podcast, and I'm really looking forward to it tomorrow.
And what is? I mean, obviously, there sounds like quite a political bent to that. That we have a system that is directing people towards poverty rather than out of it. Is that right?
Yes, and that's the truth.
Yeah.
And what we have here is a bunch of academic leaders, a lot of people from the social services communities, government, and there's going to be some really interesting speeches, including from Maria English, who runs the Impact Lab, which is doing a lot of the reports for those looking to get social investment money from the government. I spoke to her yesterday, and that'll come out as a podcast sometime in the next few weeks. And it's going to address the it's not just an elephant; it's a huge thing. We have our child poverty is worsening. In fact, announcements today from the minister that she's scaling back some of the ambitions on some of the child poverty targets, taking out of the child poverty framework any talk about mental health. And this week we had the New Zealand Health...
Doing what, Bernard? Taking out of... You mean disconnecting the implications?
Taking mental health out of the child poverty measurement framework,
that's
which
helpful.
had been set up by the previous government. And this week we had the National Health Survey, which I think is an underreported and huge resource. Every year, more than 12,000 people are given a proper survey about how they feel, their health, what's happened to them. And this year, the number of children who have been hungry in the last year has risen to 27% from 21% the previous year. And as we saw in the budget, the number of people experiencing poverty, the number of children experiencing poverty has risen in the last couple of years. And the government has actually decided to reduce its ambitions on achieving reductions in child poverty. So if
the targets aren't going your way, you just change the targets, right?
Yes.
It's a classic one of those, isn't it? That sounds pretty. Yeah.
And as the Prime Minister said, it's not about the fricking targets.
Yeah. Except that we've got targets and we're going to stick to them, and also we've got ministers who are committed to meeting their KPIs.
Yes, and it's a pretty tense old time down here in Wellington at the moment for the government. This week has been an extraordinary week. The hīkoi really, I think, surprised a few people. It certainly changed the landscape politically. You could argue it was a generational moment.
Did it change?
When over 50,000 people turn up to protest against something in a completely peaceful, direct,
the one arrest
way.
The one arrest was an amazing result, I thought.
Yeah, and the reports, and I'm as a Wellingtonian who was here for the February 2022 protests, when it got ugly and it was messy, and an awful lot of damage was done. Not a single piece of damage, no litter.
Yeah.
This was a really well-organised, direct march with lots of authentic homemade signs, lots of flags. It was a festival.
It wasn't, and there wasn't a gallows with your name on it.
No, exactly. I was quite happy about that.
Yeah.
And also it didn't come across like that. It wasn't, we want to do harm to anyone. We don't want you to proceed with this bill. It's before the Parliament. And
but it was just a Te Pāti Maori thing, I mean, they can get 50,000 people to anything. I mean, it was just purely organised by Te Pāti Maori. It had nothing to do with grassroots Maoridom, did it?
Well, when you actually looked at who was in that march
Yeah.
in Wellington, this was a broad spectrum of people. They were from many parts of the country. It was at least 3 times bigger than the protests that came to Parliament in February 2022. And if you were the ACT Party or the National Party or the Labour Party even, who wanted to organise a protest, and you got 50,000 people, you would be pretty amazed. And for the Te Pāti Māori to do it, along with, there was a lot of support from lots of other groups.
No, I know. I mean, as you know, irony doesn't really work on the internet, but I was being ironic because it clearly, it would be incredibly surprising if there weren't Te Pāti Māori people or Te Pāti Māori affiliated people there. But it did seem very grassroots driven. It seemed, polite in a sense, other than the potential inconvenience. And it did raise some really important issues. I mean, I must admit, I thought also that the haka in the House last week was actually entirely appropriate to the scale of the event, to the statement about the event. It didn't seem... I mean, I've seen many much more boring, much less uplifting items of unparliamentary behaviour in my time.
Yeah, and actually, this is how we do things in this country. When you go to a funeral these days, when you go to a celebration, when you're at any sort of official event where people want to express themselves in a strong way, there's a haka. This is what we do. This is who we are now.
Yes.
It's
actually,
no
Bernard, this is who we are now.
Yeah.
Is a very apposite comment to this, because these people are trying to change who we are now.
Yeah, and for David Seymour to describe it as an intimidating war dance is like something out of the 50s.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, who does he think he is?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got to remember the All Blacks are passionate and culturally aware whenever they do their haka. And whenever the British rugby establishment makes murmurs about, this is just a performative show that, is designed to scare us. No, it's not. It's an expression of who we are
exactly.
and saying to people, laying down a challenge, we're about to play a fantastic game of rugby here and we'd like to win. Come on in. And
I'm never sure about the All Black one, but anyway, because I won't raise that because the irony lacquer meter has gone off, including from my ex-stepmother-in-law who came across, who's I think in her late 70s, came across from Eastbourne to join the march, and when I mentioned that online, somebody said, lots of white guilt there then. And even if white guilt is a motive for going, or just understanding or social integrity, it seemed to me to be a very valid, the whole event seemed very valid. Now, but what are we doing about, I mean, where is Luxon in this? I mean, he allegedly declined to speak to the crew, partly because of this alleged Te Pāti Māori connection.
Yeah, and I mean, to give Seymour some credit, he did actually go to the side of the march. He didn't stay for long. He did some TikToking and social mediaing and then went back. But that's one more than what the Prime Minister did.
I was surprised.
And he's taking some real heat on this. To give you an idea, I quoted from an Otago Daily Times editorial on Wednesday.
Well, that left-wing rag.
Yeah, that left-wing rag. It came out and absolutely nailed Luxon to the floor by saying that he had let the genie out of the bottle for the purely personal aim of being a Prime Minister fast. And that is the guts of it. We're talking here about caving to our worst instincts simply to become the government faster than would otherwise have been the case. And remember, ACT was never going to join Labour in government. Yeah. Labour would never let ACT join. So actually, National had all the cards. If ACT wanted to be in government, they had to basically ask National nicely. Unfortunately for the Prime Minister, his negotiating skills meant that he gave away an awful lot. And there's a bunch of grumpy people in the National Party. And now the cat is out of the bag in that David Seymour and his allies have been very effective at getting this up and effectively making it the main issue in our political debate. When even as Christopher Luxon said this week, it should be something else. It should be the economy, stupid. It should be all sorts of other things. And I think he has lost control of the political narrative here now. And
Yeah.
I think the hīkoi, which was a genuinely, it was an authentic outpouring of direct commentary on the government and on Christopher Luxon's leadership. And sure, he can ignore it and say, well, it's just a parliamentary thing. But that choice he's made, which essentially was to say, well, no one will notice. This is not a big problem.
Whereas the power of striding across the parliamentary forecourt there and engaging with what was clearly a very peaceful march would have been important. Now, so should we talk about another New Zealand Prime Minister? We've had Jenny Shipley on Saturdays, making a hell of a lot of sense. I don't know her. I wasn't in the country when she was PM, but we have Helen Clark coming on today, former Prime Minister Helen Clark coming on. I think from a beach in New Zealand to talk to us. We're going to let her just. This is my way of saying what she would do, but also just to tell the audience what we're going to be doing today. We're going to spread Helen rather thin, like excellent Marmite, across the international section with Robert Patman. I'm suggesting we'd want to talk about Ukraine, Israel, the UN, and I would like to get some of Helen's views on some of these Trump appointments, and then we'll keep her on for a further discussion about the Treaty Principles Bill and these issues. And I think we should get her to address the conference that you're at. I mean, speak about this issue of poverty and that sort of thing. Is that all right, Bernard?
Yeah.
And we've also got somebody else in about half an hour, right?
Yes, we have economist and savings and investment academic Susan St. John. She'll be joining me here at the table. We'll talk about the extraordinary and powerful letter from a group of economists, including her, today to the Prime Minister saying, stop the spending cuts. You're actually hurting the economy and you're digging yourself in deeper, you're chasing your tail, and you're in conflict with your own stated objectives of, for example, doubling exports. And as we've seen today, a speech from the Treasury's chief economist saying actually things are getting worse because the economy is slower, the budget deficit's going to get worse. This is a classic case of creating a negative feedback loop and ignoring the response and just ploughing on with what is the most severe fiscal tightening in our history for no good reason. And so we'll talk to her about that. And also the IRD saying last week that they're looking at giving a tax break to the New Zealand Super Fund, which opens up an interesting opportunity for a tax switch, which might be interesting to look at. So that's
be
a busy
interesting
old
if they
day.
gave a similar tax break to the poor buggers with KiwiSavers.
As they should. Every other country in the world does it. And we are an exceptional case in that we have no capital gains tax and also no real subsidy for pension savings. And you only have to look across the Tasman to see the benefits of a large private pension system where the money going into it is partly subsidised. And if you're going to tax people.
You mean, and it becomes a genuine sovereign wealth fund, effectively.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's changed Australia, totally changed it in the space of 30 years. And it's the reason, one of the reasons, an A320 load of New Zealanders are migrating to Australia every day right now. And it's something we'll address later on in the show, which would be great. But there's also been plenty of action in the media scene.
Yeah. Well, we saw the North and South, which I had some to do. I used to have a column for North and South, and I looked at it when it was for sale, when Bauer went out of business in New Zealand. It's gone. Well, it would appear to be gone on print. Interestingly, School Road Publishing, which is part of an advertising and marketing group which has been owning it for the last 18 months or so, 2 years, has said it might bring it back, or intends to bring it back with a stronger digital presence. I mean, it certainly hasn't had a strong digital presence, but as we know, the advertising online is still very difficult, and these paper magazines have done better in theory, out of I was going to say bricks and mortar, but paper and ink. But I think it is a really difficult. It's a difficult climate for everybody. I mean, last week we talked about NZME shutting down 14 newspapers. And that's going to really cause what Gavin Ellis, the former editor of the Herald and now media academic, calls news deserts. I wonder, Bernard, and this is whether we have a strong enough media to actually handle and cover the scale of the problems and the opportunities that we're facing at the moment. Because of course, North and South is there to talk to us about ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. To give you an idea of how things are starting to slip between the cracks, earlier this week, the government tabled a brand new piece of legislation in Parliament, which was a complete rewrite of our laws to make spying for an overseas government a criminal offence. Now, this just landed in Parliament. There was no preamble, no announcement from the government. Everyone missed it, except for one reporter who happened to spy it on the website of Parliament. And this went through, it was introduced to the House and has gone through a first reading with virtually no debate in the media. Robert, it's fantastic to see you. And we were just talking about the result of the scaling down, thinning out of our media. And actually in your area, the government's tabling of a bill to criminalise spying for a foreign power came completely out of the blue, wasn't actually reported by most people until someone stumbled across it in the bowels of a parliamentary website. The government subsequently, after it had gone through the first reading in Parliament, then announced it, which is just this, and this is happening a lot.
Do you think that was a bill really at the request, in a sense, of the Security Intelligence Service? Where's it come? What's the origin of it? Do we know?
Well, Robert, you might be able to.
Well, I thought it was a bill relating to foreign interference, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I must confess, I haven't had the latest on this, but as you quite rightly say, Bernard, and good evening to both of you, and thank you for having me again on the show. But it seems to me this is a major issue that really does deserve a lot of attention, because foreign interference is a major problem for liberal democracies, particularly in this age in which we have lots of foreign-sponsored trolls in our relatively free media. And so it seems to me this is an issue that really the government had a self-interest in making sure everyone knew well in advance that this was coming up.
And instead it just landed as a bill in front of Parliament. And the way things are normally done is that the government will say, preferably before an election, hey, we'd like to introduce this legislation. This is
here's why.
Here's our policy.
Yeah.
There'd be a debate in the media, and then a few weeks or months later, there would be a bill drawn up by the Parliamentary Council's office and put before the Parliament, and there would be a first reading, a select committee process, and a second reading, and then finally it would go through Parliament and be signed off by the Governor-General after a very significant period of debate. In this case, the first we heard of it was basically landing in front of the Parliament for a first reading. And this happened on the day that the Prime Minister was meeting China's President Xi Jinping for the first time. Now, no doubt this was something he raised with the President in the discussion about foreign interference. And Xi Jinping, according to Christopher Luxon, because we only really have his word for it, said that the Chinese president was unhappy with New Zealand's consideration of joining AUKUS.
That's right.
But that the Prime Minister said that he wasn't considering China's views when thinking about trade issues, which is absolutely extraordinary. For me, this is a classic case of where a lack of places for debate and coverage of politicians is now being exploited for people who maybe want things to happen in a quieter way. Now, maybe it was convenient for the government.
Or in a distracting way.
It makes you wonder, though, Bernard, whether this is actually, it may in the short term feel very good to emasculate the media. And, I think but all of us were alarmed by the cuts in the area of media coverage. And that may seem in the short term very convenient. After all, some of our politicians have made the media a bit of a target. But actually, it's in their own interest to be kept on their toes. Because, let's face it, some of the worst decisions in politics, nationally and internationally, are made when the media is looking the other way, or they're not doing their job properly, or they're complicit. Because, a good probing media can actually bring out the best in politicians, and they need to be kept on their toes. That's what we pay them for out of taxpayers' money. So it actually is, only a short-term gain by trying to keep policy making away from the scrutiny of the media.
And what I'm seeing increasingly, because I get all of the press releases that come through from ministers' offices, from government departments, and there's been a trend towards this in the last couple of decades, as we've seen more and more political appointments inside ministers' offices making announcements and putting a political spin on the announcements of the day. But recently, and with the current government, we're seeing announcements that come out of the government which are pure spin, i.e. the substance of what's actually changed is not in the announcement. And so you then have to go and spend time going off to literally the gazettes, the gazette notices that come out of what the cabinet actually decided and what the ministry is now writing in terms of regulations and announcements to people inside the industry. Good example, just last night actually, Simeon Brown, the Transport and Local Government Minister, announced that the Local Government Funding Agency, which the government controls and which helps borrow money on behalf of councils, is going to lift its debt limit for councils so that they can borrow more, from 270% of revenues to 350. This had been foreshadowed and it wasn't a big surprise. So I dug around and lo and behold, there's a local government financing agency announcement saying, oh, and by the way, the government has increased the liquidity facility for the LGFA, i.e. the government of this nation has said it will pledge billions of dollars more to this agency, and the minister didn't announce it in this statement. You have to dig around to find it. Now that's what journalists should be doing, but that they're trying it on, and I'm seeing this more regularly.
I think there's another problem that that it's been not just distinctive to this government, but it's been accentuated, I think, and that is in a situation where we have elected officials, I do not like it when ministers who have particular responsibilities refuse to take questions on their portfolio and decline. Often we listen to Morning Report or analogous programs and we hear the minister in question on quite controversial things declines to appear. I think this is just not good enough in a democracy. I think that ministers with formal responsibilities should front up to the media. After all, they're very quick to take exception to the media and criticise them. But on the other hand, it's pretty cowardly when they will not actually basically answer questions on their formal professional responsibilities, which affects many people in this country. So, I mean, it's something where I was hoping a party might actually take this up at some point because it's been going on for some time. I know Helen Clark's not with us, but Helen was the exception to this. She was actually really prepared, almost at very short notice, to when she was Prime Minister, to basically address things very rapidly, and it's not really been repeated since, I don't think.
Yeah, it's odd because you've got this weird situation where David Seymour won't appear on Morning Report, but will appear on the afternoon show with Lisa. But as you say, it's also these areas of ministerial responsibility where things kind of dribble out or leak out, or whether it's the smoking stuff and so on. It's just that there's a sort of lack of accountability, and I think we see this, Bernard, would you agree, in the health area, where we don't really know what the government is doing about health, with Lester Levy in there, and in housing with the destruction of Kaingora.
Yeah, I mean, we're often seeing these things happening behind the scenes and dribble out, and you have to find out about them through second-hand sourcing, which, sometimes that happens, and you want someone there to do it for you. The danger, of course, is when there's no one there who's sort of independent and they're working in the public interest. The people who will find out the actual news are going to put their own spin on it. and we'll see that, and it does. I mean, I've been in the press gallery, was in the press gallery for nearly 15 years. I've helped create 2 news organisations to deal with this particular issue, and I'm very proud that even though we've seen a drop in the number of journalists in the old media, if you like, we have Newsroom and Business Desk and interest.co.nz and the spin-off to try and balance it up on the other side, and they're doing great work. But ultimately, it is a game of numbers, and when you have, and by my estimate, at most around about 200 to 300 active working journalists in areas of what I call public interest, so the courts, policy around health, education. I'm not talking sports or lifestyle or anything. I'm talking the hard stuff, the stuff that people won't pay for. And that's probably about a third what it was a decade ago. And so you've got 200 to 300 people who are actually doing the reporting on the ground, and they're up against around about 1,200 to 1,500 people who are in the what I call the PR industrial complex within the government. And it really is a shift in the balance of numbers of people, actually, and of money, on who's reporting it and who's spinning it. Welcome in, Helen. Lovely to see you.
Hi there.
Sorry, you had a little
technology.
Sorry to you and our audience, because they're hanging on your every word. And in fact, Robert was winging it for a while there by saying that unlike certain, possibly even current prime ministers and other politicians, you seldom didn't turn up when you felt it necessary or when it was necessary to front up to the press. Is that what you were saying, Robert?
Yeah, I just said I thought Helen was exemplary when she was Prime Minister, from leading from the front. I think it was, almost not every morning, but very regularly, addressing questions. I was just having a bit of a moan, Helen, that it annoys me the ministers who have formal responsibilities for particular areas decline to appear on Morning Report, and when the issue is really important and affects many people. And I think that's really something we need to look at, because it seems to me that many politicians, not all, but some politicians, are very quick to criticise the media, but they also reserve the right not to appear in the media on what they think may be issues which could politically embarrass them, or it probably would not. But I just think that's really, in a democracy, for it to function well, we do really need our ministers to be accountable.
And
Helen, would you answer that, because we're slightly, because we had a little bit of difficulty getting you in, we're slightly going in an inverse proportion, but because we started this came from a conversation about media presence, about media ability to cover politics, whether politicians had treated the hīkoi, for example, with sufficient understanding and respect the other day. Would you like to address this?
So just going back to the accessibility to the media, look, I wouldn't want to say that I never declined an interview, but what I can say is that my Monday morning, I appeared every week with Paul Holmes, who often gave me pretty rugged interview. I had a regular beat. I never agreed with Jacinda in pulling out of talking to Mike Hosking, because it's a huge audience, and I don't have the same views on things as Mike does, and nor did she. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who do. So you need to be able to reach that audience. So it is critical to be available and very accessible. The post-cabinet press conference is obviously a very important part of accountability. Every day when you walk to question time at the House, the media, they're waiting for a stand-up by the government caucus. But we're a little intimate democracy, and people do expect to see and hear from politicians. And I think with social media, politicians feel they can just go directly to the public with their Facebook Lives or Instagram Live or whatever. But it's not the same as a professional journalist doing the interview and getting the answers. So, I think, time for our politicians to have a bit of a think about accountability, because without accountability, you don't have democracy.
And what about the media too in this, Helen? So just forgive me, Bernard. Do we have enough? You used the word professional journalists there. Do we have enough? Do we have enough people asking sensible questions?
We do. I mean, clearly, our professional journalists and the media they work for are under tremendous pressure because of the business models. We've seen TV3 News as we knew it go down. We're seeing the most really quite extraordinary changes at Television One. It's a bit gutted, but you still have a press gallery of professional journalists. You've still got quality, online print sources like Newsroom, like Spin-Off. So I've got no doubt we've got the quality journalists.
Thank you.
One of the reasons this sort of came up, Helen, was that this week the government very quietly just dropped a bill in Parliament which will criminalise behaviour that is deemed to be foreign interference. And this basically, the first time we found out about it was when one journalist happened to check the parliamentary website to see if there'd been any new papers lodged. And here was a full-on bill, which within a day or two was debated in the first reading. This is something we hadn't heard about, not being talked about, happened exactly the same time as the Prime Minister was talking to President Xi Jinping. That is something that I haven't seen recently. And it's interesting too that the current Prime Minister is doing less post-cabinet. So in your time and also...
Every week.
Yeah,
every week.
Yeah. Well, currently, the rule of thumb with the current government is that when Parliament is not sitting, we are not routinely having press conferences, which will take out around about 10 to 15 news conferences a year from the schedule. And the Prime Minister is also not doing what we call caucus run. For those who don't know the parliamentary press gallery, you have two opportunities on a Tuesday to grab the Prime Minister and key ministers as they go into the caucus room, and then later on as they go into Parliament on Tuesday. Tuesday's the big day. Well, my understanding is that the current Prime Minister is not doing one of those Tuesday events. And it does worry me, in part because I know that the numbers of people who are reporting in the press gallery on Parliament is low. Most parliamentary sessions are not actually covered by the media anymore. And this for me is a concern, particularly when we've got these huge issues, like, for example, whether or not we join AUKUS. What is our relationship with our largest trading partner? These are debates that are not happening in a very broad way. So that's the background to this.
Yeah, no, fully understood. Look, again, I did a post-cab press conference after every cabinet recess or non-recess. There wasn't always a lot to say coming out of the cabinet, but of course it was a weekly opportunity for the media to ask about whatever they want to ask, and you always went down prepared to the best of your ability to answer that. To your point about the bill, what I did routinely do when I drew up my notes for the press conference was I would routinely say what bills the cabinet had agreed to bring forward. So I must say I was staggered to see this foreign interference legislation. I am absolutely unpersuaded that it is necessary. It may well be a copycat of the one the Federal Parliament of Canberra in Australia enacted some time ago. And I saw news a while back of a prosecution under that, where some hapless elderly Chinese Australian was dragged through the courts and convicted of being a foreign agent. I mean, for goodness sake.
Do you think it's a Five Eyes thing, Helen? Is it something that will be coming out?
I do, and that's become the excuse for doing a great deal of stuff now. In my time, Five Eyes wasn't even acknowledged, let alone used as an excuse for anything. But here's my fear, that we're in for a period of McCarthyism, where anyone who is seen to have a view that's different about foreign policy is shunned. And, you already hear the pejorative statements coming out of some circles in Wellington, quote, Beijing's useful idiots, about perfectly mainstream Kiwis who happen to have a view that we should be able to talk and chew gum at the same time, keep a traditional and friendly relationship with the US while also engaging with the major economy in the West Pacific, which is China.
And particularly now that we have President Trump or President-elect Trump coming, and that AUKUS debate is very live, and we are facing a situation where we could be putting our eggs into a basket where they're imposing tariffs on us, new tariffs.
Look, if nothing persuades Kiwis that AUKUS is a bad idea, it should be the prospect of New Zealand completely throwing in its lot with an unpredictable and erratic US administration. Look at the quality of the nominations to positions. Absolutely extraordinary. Never seen anything like it. Except in a banana republic, where have you ever seen the coming in head of state nominate 3 members of his own personal criminal legal defence team to senior positions in the justice area? I mean, this is absolutely unheard of. To say nothing of having an anti-vaccination and conspiracy theorist person at the Health and Human Services Department in RFK Jr. And so this is deeply disturbing. And apart from that, I think the most immediate threat we New Zealanders face is tariffs. The tariffs that President Trump is threatening are not just about Mexico and China. It's Kiwi wine and meat and other things. So, at the very same time as the government seems to have gone out of its way to offend the government of China, we suddenly have an economic threat coming from the United States of America, which somehow has become the second biggest trade partner over the past year, bigger than Australia. So this really should be cause for thought. Now, I am pleased that our Prime Minister met President Xi at APEC. I'm pleased that there's a visit on the cards. I'd like to know where the foreign minister's visit is. Usually a foreign minister will go to pave the way for the leader's visit. We're not seeing that at the moment, and we need to ask why.
And Helen, I think it's important that you didn't hold back on what you think about those appointments. To bring Robert in. Robert, we talked about it last week. We'd had, I think, Matt Gaetz at that point. We'd had Marco Rubio. We were all stupefied by the Tulsi Gabbard one. We also, just to bring this towards some specific policies, you've seen President Biden since, in the immediate aftermath of that, allow the ATACMS to be used. The British and French Storm Shadows and Scalp are now being used in Ukraine. And yet it's pretty clear that there is a squeeze coming on Ukraine. Robert, what's you first and then Helen, what's coming up with the Ukraine situation there?
Well, certainly I think the Biden administration is anxious to, or at least it appears to be anxious to get Ukraine as much support to at least tide it over the next couple of months. It's interesting that the Biden administration said it actually the reason it removed the constraints on long-range missiles, which I personally have never really accepted. I didn't agree with it. If you invade another country, as Russia has, and annexed up to 20% of that country's territory, I don't think you can expect to be immune from retaliation that affects your own territorial space. But it seems to me that they're trying. The Biden administration is trying, mindful that Mr. Trump appears to be on his way to the White House, mindful to try and give Zelensky as much support in the interim as possible. And already the Ukraine government is using these long-range missiles, the ATACMS, and also we know that those the Scalp and also the Storm Shadows have been used in the last 12 hours, apparently to spectacular effect. And interestingly, I saw a report coming out of Moscow that the Russian general staff are extremely worried that Ukraine may really make some quite significant strategic gains in the next 6 weeks or so, which could cause real problems for Mr. Putin. Of course, Mr. Putin, for his part, has tweaked Russia's nuclear doctrine in an attempt to try to persuade Western backers of Ukraine, which is the victim of aggression and an invasion, to basically try to get them to think again about the sort of support they're now lending. But I definitely, that's how I would see the situation. And the Biden administration certainly is citing the case of North Korean troops being around Kursk as a reason why they felt they could now remove the constraints. But it's quite late.
Yeah, Helen, how do you read this? Because it is pretty extraordinary to think that the war has all of a sudden instantly been internationalized with boots on the ground from North Korea. And you've got these, you've worked at the UN. I mean, this is a pretty extraordinary. Is Ukraine being squeezed here?
Look, the first point I want to make is that I think that history will judge the Biden administration's foreign policy very, very harshly. The Afghanistan debacle, we'll never forget. And yes, you can argue that it was set up by President Trump and the former US ambassador to Afghanistan who negotiated the withdrawal with the Taliban. But he carried it through, he executed it. It was a debacle and a humiliation for the United States. Secondly, Israel-Palestine disaster, and I'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah,
Thirdly, the attempt to contain China, which won't work and further polarizes our region. And then we have Ukraine, where frankly they've been on, off. You can do this, you can't do that. You might get the money. Yes, it's coming. No, it's coming. I mean, how can anyone plan like that? Now, it may be that, as Robert says, with this sudden latitude that Ukraine's been given, that it might make some gains. But everyone knows this is a lame duck administration that's trying to recover something from all this that is outgoing within the next 2 months. So it was always clear that if President Trump came in, he would be wanting Ukraine to sue for peace or an armistice of some kind. The issue now is, I think, whether the Russians overreact to the use of the NATO weapons directly into Russian territory in this 2-month interval, or whether they just take it on the chin and wait for Trump to wrap the whole thing up.
Okay, and what about Israel? So
Okay,
we've got
let me
Israel's
come
been
to
given
this.
Israel's been given carte blanche to do what it likes
Yeah.
until Trump arrives. Is that
Yeah,
certainly the appearance?
no red line is observed. So here's the point. In the lame duck period of the Obama administration, before President Trump took office, for the first time, the United States abstained on a resolution at the Security Council 2334, which deemed the settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories to be illegal. And that enabled that resolution to stand, and it's a very important international law marker. So there were some hopes that in this lame duck period of this administration, which has given Israel such extraordinary latitude, there might have been a similar approach to the Security Council. Far from this, everything I am hearing and seeing says that they are doubling down, and that was confirmed in a vote on a new resolution which called for a complete, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and the complete and unconditional release of hostages. That resolution was vetoed by the United States, with all 14 other members of the Security Council voting in favor of it. Now, this is completely reprehensible. There could have been a binding Security Council resolution which stopped this conflict, and the United States stops it. Everybody's gobsmacked,
And Helen,
looking at the statements coming out of the Security Council. I mean, the British voted for it, the French voted for it, the Slovenians and whoever else came from the little Western group that we're part of voted for it, and the United States vetoed it, even in the dying days of administration.
But Helen, let me, and this is a question to Robert as well. We've got Stefanik, the new United Nations ambassador to the United Nations, is a rather strong supporter of Israel. You've got various people supported by AIPAC, the Israeli lobby group in the US, and you've got Mike Huckabee, who's on record as saying there are no Palestinians and there is no West Bank. I mean, this is not going to get any better, is it?
Look, the only wild card in all of this is the relationship of the US with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have been hanging very tough on the Abraham Accords, which both the Trump administration and the Biden administration wanted them to sign with Israel, which would have established diplomatic relations, etc. The United Arab Emirates has already done that. The Saudis have hung tough. They have said they will not sign any such thing until there is a Palestinian state. And one would like to see the words "a meaningful Palestinian state" in that. President Trump has stayed close to the Saudis. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, used to be full-time on the case of building the relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and effective ruler. So this is the wild card. While all the rhetoric tells us disaster, when I was in the UN for the General Assembly meetings in late September, there was a prevalent view there in many circles that the election of President Trump would be a green light for annexation of the West Bank, which would be inflammatory. But watch what the Saudis do.
So isn't it weird that so Robert, would you like to address that? It is very interesting that we're waiting for that the Saudis are so pivotal here, of course, as they are with Iran as well. Robert, would you like to address that?
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on a point
Helen
Helen's introduced, which is really important. I think that the Western allies of the United States should speak out, because Israel, far-right coalition, has made it quite clear early in 2025 they will be going ahead with the formal annexation of West Bank. Now, our government has so far declined to recognise the Palestinian state. Well, I think we're running out of time. So we need to make our position absolutely clear that we do stand for a two-state solution, not just in form, but in substance as well. And I think that other allies of the United States they won't change the climate dramatically, but it's very important that other liberal democracies make it quite clear. Remember, New Zealand voted in the UN General Assembly to support the ICJ's ruling that the Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and also almost pseudo-occupation of Gaza is illegal. And we accepted that. So we now have to walk the talk. And I think, I agree with Helen, the Biden's position has been disastrous, not only for the Palestinians, but also actually for American interests throughout the world. But we shouldn't overlook the allies of the United States who have largely kept their head down. I think it's time for them to change that position now.
Robert, we're just going to, you're welcome to stay on, but Helen, we wanted to ask, but we normally sort of split it half-half between domestic and international, but we have Bernard has a guest there with them in Wellington who'll take over in a moment. But we wanted to ask you, a couple of times ago when you came on, and we do enjoy having you on, and the audience really enjoys having you on, you talked about your experience with the foreshore and seabed, and said something that you might have thought about it quite differently had it happened now. What's your take now, having seen that hīkoi, having seen the bill come to Parliament, and the risks that it pose? What's your take on where we stand with that right now?
So, in the first place, if anyone in the government's many advisors in 2004 had come up with a proposal, which they later came up with for John Key's government, that the foreshore and seabed should be deemed to belong to no one, we would have embraced that with enthusiasm. But that option was never given to us. I wish it had been. Secondly, as I've indicated, maybe here and certainly elsewhere, I think in some ways the last government took some of the issues relating to Māoridom further than where the mainstream of New Zealand public was comfortable. Not in all things, but on some. Now, what we now have is a very savage counter-reaction to that, which has gone far too far. And with respect
to...
Sorry,
could just explain, what is the savage counter-reaction to that? Is that the bill?
Well, the savage counter-reaction is the whole package of things which Māoridom sees as an assault on its rights and status. And the tipping point is the Treaty Principles Bill. Because any reasonable person, I would have thought, would say that a treaty is signed between parties. And so one party, which is in control of the state and its legislative mechanism, cannot unilaterally legislate what the principles of a treaty, which was signed by two parties, are. Now, the principles have developed over time in the courts, and they may not like that. But you cannot unilaterally rewrite a treaty. That's basic, and that's why people have come out, Māori and Pākehā.
So, Helen, just 1 second. But what did you make of what Jenny Shipley said the other day, Helen, where she talked about? I don't know whether she was floridly talking about a civil war and so on, but is there an issue here? You've got another Prime Minister following from you. You've got the National Party having done 40 years of work on this with Finlayson and so on.
Yeah.
what do you think about that? And sorry, Bernard, you do go ahead for the last one.
Yes. Well, I mean, Jenny has been, very supportive of trying to build relations between partners, as it were. Jim Bolger, of course, brought forward the first of the major treaty settlements with the Tainui settlement some 20 years ago. Chris Finlayson played an extremely important role in John Key's government. John Key went to the National Party conference and told them to dial it down, quote unquote, on the treaty. Doug Graham, of course, did amazing work on treaty settlements. So I think among those seniors in the National Party family, there is very, very deep concern about how divisive this is.
Thank you, Helen.
I wonder, Helen, as someone who's done these coalition forming negotiations, whether the current Prime Minister misjudged his own power and the risks of allowing this to go through a first reading, also misjudged the nation's mood about how damaging or risky this would be.
Yes, I think there's a lot of misjudgment and quite a lot of politics, actually. You see, David Seymour made this a condition of being a coalition partner. But hey, if the National Party has stared him down and said, we can't go there, David, because all our history is around negotiating and at least our history of modern times is around negotiating under the framework of the treaty. What was David going to do? He wasn't going to cross the floor to Chris Hipkins and say, I'll join a government with you, right? So what he would have been is outside the government, but he would have been a support party. And the National Party, would have carried on, presumably in coalition with Winston. So it was a misjudgment not to stare this down. But then you have to ask, why did they all let it go to a select committee and not kill it on the first reading? Why didn't Winston kill it on the first reading? And it's all politics because they're all looking at their voting bases. The National Party doesn't want ACT stealing too many voters from it on this issue, so it's having a bob each way. Winston doesn't want David Seymour stealing too many votes for him on this issue, so he's having a bob each way. The problem is they're having a bob each way ensures that for the next 6 months, this issue dominates. And frankly, if I were the PM, the last thing I would want dominating is this for the next 6 months, because there's quite a lot of other things government's got to do, right?
Yeah.
Rather than constantly be on the back foot on this. So overall, a misjudgment. And there's a lot of politics around it, but the politics is counterproductive.
Thank you very much, Helen. And you're exactly right on the issue of, there are some other things the government has to address at the moment, one of which is the economy. We're lucky to have with us here in Wellington Susan St John, who was one of the economists who signed up to the letter to the Prime Minister that was published today, calling on the current government to abandon its budget cuts. Susan, could you tell us a bit about, how this group came together and what was the plan?
Well, I think a number of us could remember back to 1991 when I was a young economist at that time, absolutely appalled at the spending cuts when you were already in a recession. And as a result of that kind of deficit busting approach, we got an explosion in child poverty. And then you got things like rise in third world diseases. All of the things correlated with the kind of cuts we saw then. And unfortunately now we're seeing the same thing, only families that are affected are probably in a much worse situation than they were in 1991. And the damage that's being done is extremely worrying. And I'm very proud to be part of a group of economists that are speaking up and supporting things like you've been saying, Bernard.
Yeah, on that issue of essentially the government chasing its own tail, cutting into an economy that's in recession, the group of economists made the correct point, I think, that this was actually hollowing out existing businesses, not to mention the workforce, as a lot of people go to Australia. How important or how much of a worry is this issue of the government essentially creating a negative feedback loop of cutting into an economy which is already falling?
Well, you know that deficits will widen in a recession. And of course, the opposite happens when you go into surplus. But if you come along and then cut spending again, I mean, it just makes the deficit worse. It makes everything worse. and it throws people out of work. Where is the work for those people to actually be transferred into? It's non-existent. The confidence in the economy winds down, jobs are lost, and the whole vicious circle goes down further than it really is necessary for it to do.
Yeah, it's been interesting, the response from the government.
Bernard, just grab the microphone back from...
Sure. It's been interesting, the response from the government, essentially sort of brushing off the letter as from a group of economists who are from a different part of the spectrum to the current government. But it is interesting that a lot of businesses are also seeing the same thing. The Contractors Federation is saying that the drop-off in orders for new roadworks, the suspension of Kāinga Ora's building program, you can see that flowing through in the building consents and the work. I wonder whether the government is getting advice or whether it has actually explained its fiscal strategy, because at the moment all we've got is a vague idea that, you know, we need to tighten our belts and that's a good thing, when actually the fiscal record of austerity programs is they don't actually work.
That's right, and we should know that by now. It is extremely worrying. We're seeing our brightest and best take off to Australia and the hollowing out that you've talked about, and I'm very fearful of the social scarring. We can see it all around us, the social disintegration. That is going to take such a lot of effort to repair, and the further we go down this track, the more irreversible it's going to be. So I'm very fearful of the future for New Zealand if we continue.
Helen, I wonder whether you have a view on that, but what you've just heard from Susan. Would you? I mean, the divisiveness of this and the risks.
Yeah, no, totally in agreement. And like Susan, I was a much younger person in 1991 with the Motherwell budgets and the Ruth Richardson cuts. And I recall at the time when the benefits were cut that even the dairies were saying for the first time they couldn't shift bread and milk off the shelves. It deepened poverty, and poverty is deepening again now. And it's almost as if, you know, there's callously a whole cohort of our society that's being left behind. You know, they don't vote for the people in power at the moment. They're not relevant to them. They inhabit a different world, somehow almost non-citizens. And it is extremely divisive and polarizing. And once you allow that to happen and break the bonds, which, you know, tenuous bonds which bind us as a society, you get even less engagement. You get fewer people voting, fewer people participating, because grinding poverty just takes you so far down that you just have to focus on keeping your head above water day to day. How do you put food on your own table, food on the table for your family? How do you find a home? So I think it's extremely troubling.
You mentioned, Helen, the divisiveness and the cohesion that's lost, and people becoming disconnected from politics or a view that society was for them. What did you think, though, of the hīkoi this week and the numbers that walked through Wellington and the outpouring of, you know, a very public, strong view against the government, with people actually, you know, on the streets? It's not just hitting the like button or replying all.
Well, one would like to think there's still that basic Kiwi fairness instinct, that it isn't right for one party to a treaty to just rewrite its principles, and that it's so precious that we hang on to that sense of decency, that we have to be fair to each other and respect, you know, core elements of the contract which bind us together. So that's positive. Look, how it will wash out in the great court of opinion, who knows? There's just so many issues coming at people at the moment. The ones Susan's been mentioning, the ones that Māori are concerned about, the whole sort of hashtag war on nature, which is really quite extreme at the moment. The foreign policy manoeuvre back into a strategic alignment with the US, which never featured in any election campaign. So I think people are a bit overwhelmed at the moment by the issues.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's been lovely to have you on the show. And,
thanks again, Helen.
And Robert, a cracking tour de force around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, great. Both of you. And Helen, I hope everything was all right down there, and we'll talk to you soon. Sorry you had a bit of difficulty coming in.
Thanks.
Cheers. Lovely.
Thank you, Susan.
Just
Bye.
one final question for Susan, if it's all right. We had Helen Clark on there, who, along with Michael Cullen, organised and created not just the New Zealand Super Fund, but KiwiSaver. And one of the most interesting, quirky things around tax that's come out in the last couple of weeks is this idea that's sort of been floated out there through the IRD that the New Zealand Super Fund not have to pay tax to the government, because it's now currently paying literally hundreds of millions of dollars in tax after receiving capital payments from the government. Susan St John is as well as an economist, is an expert in looking at the mechanics, not just of things like working for families, but the pension system, and has a view on New Zealand Super Fund. What do you think about this idea of the New Zealand Super Fund not having to pay tax to the government? Because that, in theory, could mean that the compounding interest will mean there's a lot more money at the end of the process.
But the government would get less tax, and you have to understand the formula that goes into determining how much is paid into the fund and how much ultimately comes out. And if the fund was able to retain tax within the system, then the government itself would have to contribute less when it was contributing, or it would get back more once it starts withdrawing. But actually, all that does is make up for the lost revenue. It's not actually creating anything, because we have consolidated accounts now, and the super fund is part of that, even though we put this artificial ring around it and say that it's separate.
Is there an opportunity here, though, to have a wider debate about reinstating the sort of pension subsidies that you see in other countries as part of a tax switch? Because if you're going to bring in a wealth tax or a land tax or whatever it is you're thinking, it's going to be quite hard to convince those people who are wealthy that it works for them. Whereas if you're able to say, we want to change the incentives in the economy away from residential land investment and get more money being put into real companies, you could do it by saying pension funds and KiwiSaver funds wouldn't have to pay tax.
Well, we do need to have more revenue, and if you're going to work out ways of giving it away, what you're going to do is to reintroduce something that was really regressive, benefited those that saved the most, high income, long-serving career men, basically, when we had tax incentives. So if you want to bring that back, it would be extremely costly and very regressive.
Susan St John there. Thank you very much, Susan, for being with us on the show. It's been all around the place. We've had a cracking look at the issues of the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we should say to the YouTube audience, of course, that Simon, our wonderful producer and Bond, slices all this together and makes it sound significantly more professional. We're sorry we had a couple of technical issues getting Helen in. But Bernard, I had a sort of mini skateboarding dog, which is, I mean, people are talking about this relationship between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And of course, if you talk to people like Michael Wolff, who know that Trump is very transactional, has no real friends, has only a gigantic ego, and that he might quite quickly get a bit tired of Elon Musk appearing to be hanging around in Mar-a-Lago a little longer and commenting too much on appointments. And Elon's just tweeted, "I really enjoy spending time with President real Donald Trump. My direct experience is that he is a great guy with an excellent sense of humour," which brackets no one has ever said. He's legendary for not having a sense of humour. Haven't seen him do one bad thing even once. To be clear, while I have offered my opinion on some cabinet candidates, many selections occur without my knowledge and decisions are 100% that of the president.
Yeah, we wait to see how long before that relationship breaks down.
Yeah.
I can't recall, if you look at the people around Trump now, how many of them have been with him for a very long time who aren't members of his family. Essentially,
That's right, none.
He burnt through every appointment.
Yeah.
And I think more than half of the people, particularly in the security and army establishment who worked with him in the first time, basically said, "Don't vote for this guy. He's a danger to democracy." So it is quite a thing, and I think it's going to be one of the great stories of the next couple of years is how all of these people fall out with Trump.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can survive it, but thank you, Bernard, and thank you for putting it together from Wellington, and thank you, of course, to Simon as well.
Fantastic.
and the
show.
audience most particularly.
Thank you. And we will say goodbye and see you all again next week. Ka kite anō.
See you.
Wow, that was a great show.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it was a bit. I mean, I think, Simon, that seemed